While I was still working on Apistogramma Elizabethae, I got myself a small group of a less common but beautiful species called Apistogramma Elizabethae. Their reputation, as I've gathered, is for being on the more challenging end of the spectrum. I do think that they're more sensitive than standard fare Apistos, but a few months and one Faustian bargain later, I still managed to get the job done. I used the same general tank setup that I have in the past. In this case, a 10-gallon with fine sand, low-flow filtration, and plenty of overhead cover provided by these plants. This clay pot acted as a cave for them to spawn in, and also let me keep an eye on what was happening inside. I kept the water at right about 80 degrees and used 100% RO water, meaning zero general or carbonate hardness. I allowed the water to acidify naturally, and for this species I think that's very important. The fish started spawning almost immediately, but it wasn't until the pH dropped to about 5.3 that I started seeing fertility. I started by introducing a female to the tank, giving her a few days to explore the space and identify the cave as a potential spawning site. I always put some effort into conditioning females to spawn with a rich diet, and as usual I leaned heavily on live brine shrimp and Daphnia. As we go forward, I want to point out a couple of things that I think could be helpful for sexing. My guess is, if you're in a position to breed Elizabethae, you probably don't need the help, but just for good measure. There are quite a few common dimorphisms to look for in Apistos, but these have a couple that are fairly easy to spot. Notice the shorter length of these dorsal fin rays, and also the round shape of the caudal fin. On males, you ought to see more angular and extended dorsal fin rays, as well as a distinct caudal fin shape. It's almost spade-shaped, but with a concave truncation forming 2 points instead of one. As I watch these fry grow into young adults, those seem to be the most apparent differences, regardless of what colors they wear at any given time. After giving the female some time to get comfortable, I added a male. This is always an interesting dynamic to watch. Males are eager to breed immediately, but the first response from a female is usually, "Get out of my house." So I released the male and let them negotiate. The male's strategy for courtship was essentially following the female around, constantly, and just staring at her. This is typically a nonviolent process, but it can get a bit tense at times. One thing the female really didn't care for was having an uninvited guest in her new cave. When I watch this, it reminds me of that scene from Rocky where he shows up at Adrian's apartment, she keeps telling him to leave, but he won't, and eventually she just gives up, and later she marries him. That's how I pair Apistos. Even after both fish are, let's say, mentally ready to spawn, I think it takes a couple of days for the female to physically prepare for it. My assumption is there are some physiological changes that have to happen before a female is ready to discharge eggs, and she'll also want to prepare the spawning site. In the day or two prior to spawning, she spent a good deal of time cleaning the ceiling of the cave. With the benefit of monitoring what's happening in here, this is the first sign I look for that a spawn is coming soon. This is a bit odd given their typical persistence, but sometimes male Apistos can get pretty oblivious. If they aren't around when the female is ready, she'll go find him and lead him inside the cave. It usually takes a few practice runs, but the female will soon begin to deposit rows of eggs on the ceiling of the cave. This here is not a good start to an orderly cluster, which in my observation threatens the outcome of the whole spawn. I've seen the same females produce both orderly and very disorderly egg clusters, and I don't yet understand what makes the difference. Watching the scattershot approach to male fertilization, it stands to reason that a tighter cluster would be more likely to be fertilized effectively. Subsequent hatch rates, in my observation, are lower from a loose, scattered grouping of eggs. In another spawn, I saw for the first time another more catastrophic consequence of a loose egg cluster. One thing I really enjoy, just as a thought exercise, is watching animals and trying to form conjectures about why they do what they do. And remember that word, conjecture, and don't quote me on this, but I've noticed in the past that males seem more likely to eat loose eggs deposited outside of a main cluster. I wonder if it might be an instinct. We as observers know that infertile eggs become dangerous over time to the fertile ones, and we also know that they can be a valuable food source. I don't think the fish are really cognizant of why they do things, but it's plausible that an impulse like this could be the result of natural selection. There could also be a simpler explanation. Maybe the males see a loose egg and their only thought is, "I'm hungry and I don't think she'll notice if I eat this one." Either way, it's fun to think about. The females do notice, though, and react if they catch the male snacking on the job. What made this spawn unique to me was that once the male started eating eggs, he wouldn't stop. This led to the most aggressive female reaction I've ever seen and actually stopped the spawn. The female forcibly ejected the male from the cave and came back later to eat these eggs herself. A total loss. So let's skip to the first viable spawn. This female likes to place her eggs wherever will be most difficult for me to film, but at least this time the male was better behaved. As you can see, this spawn produced a much neater cluster. After a successful Episto spawn, I almost always remove the male from the tank. I haven't yet seen any parental care from a male, and the risks of leaving him in the tank are considerable. He might come back and eat eggs, eat fry, or harass the female to spawn again a week later. In this case, you can see the male sitting outside the cave and obviously making the female uncomfortable. To me, this alone is enough to kick him out. She needs to be focusing on her eggs, not fretting over his intentions. I watched this for a while because I want to leave open the possibility that some male of some species might co-parent. I just haven't seen it yet. I moved the male to another tank so that he could train for Rocky 2 and left the female to care for her eggs. She carried on cleaning and fanning water over the eggs for a couple of days, just as I would expect. When it came time for the eggs to hatch, though, she surprised me again. I woke up one morning expecting to find the cave littered with wigglers, and instead found it empty. I first chalked this up to an infertile spawn that the female would have eaten. What actually happened was that sometime during the night, she must have picked up the freshly hatched fry and moved them to a dark spot in the back of the tank. She brought them back to the cave eventually, but I didn't see them for the first time until they were already free swimming. And this is where I started feeding. As a first food, I gave them fry powder mixed with water and released near them with a long pipette. I did this several times a day for the first 2 days with the goal of putting just enough size on them to start taking baby brine shrimp comfortably. This is from a second spawn in a different tank where I got a nice view of these early days. I continue feeding the adult female, usually with brine shrimp, so the fry tend to transition on their own as they get comfortable eating them. I'm not usually home enough to feed at the intervals that I would like, so I tend to offer a little more food than the fry will want at one time, and then let them pick at the leftovers until the next time I'm available. Once they're on brine shrimp and their bodies start to darken in color like this, I consider them to be fairly secure. If we skip forward a couple weeks, they're starting to look like fish. Still closely guarded by the female, but much more independent. 6 weeks later, they're fairly well grown and displaying some of their adult coloration. Still too young to sell, but coming along nicely. By this time, the adult female had completely lost interest and actually seemed to get annoyed that they were still hanging around. Between 1 and 2 months of age, I try to keep an eye on the adult female, and if I see her snapping at the juveniles, I'll move her out of the tank too. And here they are today at just over 4 months old. They're sexable, at a sellable size, and they're looking great. I've since moved them into a 20 long, and over the last month I've been getting them ready to find new homes. They weren't just hatched, but also raised in soft, acidic water, and while Epistos are quite happy in those parameters, I'm taking some time to slowly acclimate them to my local tap water, and also to eating dry foods. I'm hoping to make their transition to a new home as smooth as possible. So that's about it for Apistogramma Elizabethae. For those who already have some experience with Epistos and have these on the bucket list, I see a necessarily low pH as the only real obstacle. Otherwise, no major differences from common species that would make the process more difficult. I'm working on a few species right now, but as of today, I'm thinking the next video will be another look at German blue rams, this time focusing entirely on raising them artificially. I've been having great luck with the new fry tray, so I'm looking forward to talking through a spawn. In the meantime, have fun, make lots of fish, and I'll see you then.